if you present a problem directly associated with a specific set of solutions and you don't like the solutions, you might not agree on the problem. And if you don't agree on the problem, why should you collaborate?
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we make the case for conserving nature and its biodiversity by building a robust, credible argument, one that sometimes requires us to re-examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Collaboration is one of the most widely accepted ideas in environmental governance. When faced with a complex problem, the instinct is almost always to bring stakeholders together and work toward a shared solution. When that process fails, the response is often to just collaborate harder or try to collaborate harder. But what if that instinct is sometimes counterproductive? What if the sheer number of collaborative initiatives is stretching participants so thin that none of them achieve very much? And what if the conflicts that collaboration is supposed to resolve are actually being deepened by the process itself? To explore these questions, I spoke with previous guest Örjan Bodin, professor at Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. Örjan's research examines how networks of actors collaborate or fail to collaborate around environmental problems, and what determines whether those efforts lead to meaningful outcomes. We discuss why collaboration is not always the best response to every problem, how conflict and cooperation coexist, the role of power imbalances in shaping outcomes, why trust takes far longer to build than most initiatives allow for, and whether the small incremental wins that sometimes feel unsatisfying might actually be the best path to lasting progress.
Collaboration is often seen as the solution to all problems in the environmental domain. And often also you see that if you have a collaborative initiative and it doesn't really succeed in terms of coming up with some solutions or doesn't even move forward at all, then the response would be, we need to collaborate even harder. And it goes on and on like that. And often you don't see any tangible result coming out from that. So that somehow made me question this, like, is collaboration always a good solution to all type of problems? And I would say no, but maybe yes, because this is a tricky one. Depends a little bit on what type of problem and also at what level here. So if we talk, for example, about international collaboration between different states, collaboration might be the only way to deal with problems unless you want to engage in war, for example. Sometimes you even need to collaborate when engaging in war. So it's like, depends a little bit on the domain or the scale. So collaboration, again, might be the only preferable solution to many type of problems. But it doesn't mean that collaboration is always the best solution to all problems on all levels. And I think, for example, when you get down to something which is smaller than international collaboration, there are other ways to deal with problems. Or maybe you can actually use collaboration, but maybe you need to reframe the objective of the collaboration. So, for example, assume you have a very critical environmental problem, and you realize we need to collaborate, or at least that's the solution you think about in terms of addressing this problem. And you gather stakeholders and actors that you think are relevant, and then you ask them, or they ask themselves, like, we need to fix the problem. But if the problem is very complicated, it's kind of surrounded with multiple conflicts of interest and so on, it might be an impossible task. And then no matter how much you collaborate, it's not going to lead to anything. And then people might think this is a waste of time. And it could even make the conflict even worse because you find yourself constantly arguing with your opponents and you don't find that kind of middle ground. You don't really understand why they are disagreeing with you and so on. And in those cases, you just want to collaborate more. It's not necessarily a good solution. So that's essentially the reason for saying, like, it's not necessarily the best solution to all type of problems, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't collaborate. My point here is that we can collaborate in a smarter way. And in some cases, there might be other means than just gathering as many as you can and set up meetings and try to come up with solutions. You can think about other things like using the law, for example, or other ways to deal with problems, which also might require some type of collaboration, though. But I think the point is that reframe a little bit the problem could in many cases be useful. So this is something that, for example, Melanie Ostrom mentioned in her work, like we have this big problem in front of us and we need to collaborate because there are so many different stakeholders and actors and no one can by themselves fix the problem. So there might be some collective realization that we need to collaborate to find a solution. But our disagreement and conflicts of interest are so high, so we cannot really find a good solution in the first run. So maybe then try to focus on something where we can actually agree on something. And Eleanor called it small win. Others might put different names on it, like problem reframing, as I think Barbara Gray emphasized, that you cannot rethink the problem in a way that these actors that have this disagreement might find ways to at least agree on something, which might not address the big problem, but it could address a smaller problem. And then maybe ideally from that small win, you can build the trust and the momentum. And from there on, you can tackle more difficult problems.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you will then in the end be able to tackle more difficult problem, but it could be one way to make it more effective, essentially by lowering the ambition a little bit. So that's one thing I think in terms of collaboration, not necessarily being the problem to all solutions. And then, for example, there is research, this is a similar point, but the research is saying that if the conflict level is very high, like the disagreement are high, or the conflict is seen as very salient, like this is a very severe conflict and there's a lot of public attention to it, collaboration is actually not useful at all. What's going to happen most likely would be that the most powerful actor will win, which means also think about other ways than collaboration to deal with the problem.
So one question here is just, when you talk about collaboration, that can mean different things. And in my experience, maybe I'm conflating two different things here, but another sort of buzzword is participation or engagement, right? So, and this is or involvement, so of different stakeholders. So to what extent are you talking about involvement, or I know that all those three words I mentioned have slightly different meaning, but to what extent are you drawing on those when you say collaboration? Are you talking about something different, or does it include this sort of participation and engagement and involvement?
Good point. It's like, I think like in the literature, people use different phrases for things which are quite similar, not necessarily the same thing. But for example, some people talk about participatory governance and others collaborative governance, others use governance, and others might talk about network governance and so on. And there are nuances between these different perspectives, but I think in the end, what it's about is trying to gather a group of actors, stakeholders. If you are only within the public domain, it would be different public agencies, for example. And if you broaden that up a bit, getting into governance of various kinds, then it would be public agencies and then also other actors like NGOs, private companies, residents, and others like different representatives from the more from the public, essentially,
and communities.
And you
right?
want to bring them together to with different stakes and interest in the issues being discussed, and then you want all of them to collaborate on something. But your point is like, what is essentially collaboration, and what is the objective of the collaboration? And I think that's one of those things that if you were to set up a collaborative initiative, this is something you can actually work with. So if you, again, what is the reason for the collaboration? And I think that's often the question that participants ask themselves, like, why are we here? What should we do? What is the purpose of this collaboration? And figuring that out could take a long time itself, unless it's a clearly framed objective with this collaborative initiative. But of course, on the other end, or on the other side, it's like if you have a very clear defined objective, then maybe the first thing that could happen would be that all these different actors disagree on the objective. And then you have a long discussion about what should we actually do and so on. It becomes quite much a balancing act in many cases.
Yeah. And, the reason I asked that was because I have a maybe slightly cynical suspicion that a lot of collaboration / participation / engagement is sort of a bit of a box ticking exercise, involving all the relevant stakeholders, whether they asked to be involved or not, and whether they have a really important contribution to make or not. And I mean, this is one of those things you have to be careful to say, right? Because you don't want to exclude people who should be included. But I worry and I suspect that often their inclusion is a little bit superficial.
I agree. It could be a box ticking exercise, but again, it depends a little bit on the objective.
Mm-hmm.
So if the objective is very broad, then it would make sense to include a high number of different actors and stakeholders, because the problem or the issue itself spans across different domains and scales and whatever. So it would be a bit hard not to include everyone, or at least a fairly high number of stakeholders and actors. But of course, the more you're involved, and if they also have different opinions about stuff, then the more difficult you make it for yourself to actually succeed. But on the other hand, as you were pointing to, if you exclude some actors, then you lose maybe some of the legitimacy of the collaborative initiative itself, because you didn't include the ones that should have been included. And again, should have been included. Who defines who should have been included? So yes, I think it could be a little bit of a box-ticking exercise, but it's something that you need to think very hard about, because there are pros and cons in being more or less exclusive in terms of the ones you invite.
Yeah, it also reminds me, and this is sort of maybe a little bit abstract, but it reminds me of a comparison that I heard being made between the MDGs and the SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and the successors, the Sustainable Development Goals. And as far as I understand, and this is probably an oversimplification, but basically the MDGs were developed by Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN at that time, and about 6 or 7 other people, high-level people sitting in a room together. And they were pretty successful. They did a pretty good job on many levels. And the SDGs were very different in that they were, well, first of all, there were the process was very different because they included absolutely everybody. And, that was every UN agency, every organization, every sector of society, every major group, et cetera, et cetera. And the result was this incredibly long list of goals and 169 targets and I don't know how many indicators. And then the same sort of objective, which is to achieve all of these, by a certain date. So the point there is that maybe if you have a smaller number of people, you don't try to collaborate too much, you might come up with a more doable goal. And just one other analogy is just the way that multilateral environmental agreements work. Many of them work by complete consensus. Everyone has to agree to a particular decision before it can go forward, and therefore that decision is going to be highly diluted and really not what it needs to be. So I guess it makes me think you're right about being skeptical about collaboration, because it has quite obvious drawbacks in these realms.
But I think it's a good illustration, because I think, and we talked about trade-offs, and we probably will talk a bit about trade-offs, but this is definitely a trade-off when it comes to how to design a collaborative initiative. Because I think, like, in speaking in favor of the SDG would be like, since you have so many actors involved, essentially, as you say, everyone, you can hope for a higher buy-in. Like all these actors participated in the process, and therefore they stand behind the outcome, the SDGs in that case, which is, I would say, a positive outcome. The negative outcome, or maybe not negative, but the complicated outcome with all these numerous policy suggestions and objectives and so on, is that the complexity of the outcome makes it really hard to actually work with it. So that could be on the downside. And as you indicated here, like if you have a very high number of actors and stakeholders with different interests and you want them to collaborate, maybe the easiest way to come up with a solution is for all of them to just list their favorite objectives, and then you bundle everything in together in one big document, and everyone can agree on that. But they haven't really addressed the hard trade-offs doing that. So which is like on the downside. So the upside, higher buy-in. Downside, there's a risk that you somehow dilute or you spread out the result, the solutions, in something which is really hard to work with.
Right. You have written about the relationship between conflict and cooperation, which a lot of people would think of as being, complete polar opposites to each other. But as I understand it, your argument is that these are two phenomena that coexist. And
Yes.
I guess that it's kind of unavoidable that they coexist. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think part of the reason for emphasizing that collaboration and conflict tend to occur together to some extent is coming from how we organize research to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch of scholars investigating and working and emphasizing conflict, and there's another bunch of scholars emphasizing collaboration. I'm probably part of the latter group.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look into like a more practical collaborative endeavor, you most likely find both conflict and collaboration happening at the same time. And for example, if we think about the environmental problem, why would we even try to collaborate? Because there's a problem. And what is the problem then? Often you have different actors and stakeholders that have different interest in the resource or the resources, which means that there is a conflict of interest. So there is conflict. And the reason that to collaborate is try to address that conflict of interest or the conflict to come up with something which is more sustainable or some kind of solution that would mean that all the actors might lose some but gain some and so on. Mm-hmm. So this is like, in many cases, the very foundation for actually having a collaborative initiative happening is that there is conflict. Mm-hmm. And then, as you say, like it tends to be seen as a opposite side of something. But then the argument will be that both of them are playing out at the same time, which means that the way that people feel having conflicts of interest also affect how they collaborate with each other and what they might be aiming for and so on. Which means maybe mostly from a research point of view, is like if we study these different processes separately, you study collaboration separately, you study conflict separately, there's a risk that we miss that very important interplay between conflict and collaboration. And as you say, like conflict could then be seen as something negative from the collaboration point of view. But again, like the conflict might actually be the driver for collaboration. Mm-hmm. And you can even think about the case that if two actors have a conflict of interest, they might think about a range of alternatives to deal with that conflict. And one of them is obviously trying to win over the other one. It's like, I'm going to beat you. We have a conflict of interest and I want to use the resource myself. On the other end of that spectrum, in terms of how to deal with the conflict, would be, okay, I don't think I can win. I cannot beat you. Then I have to work with you. And then you choose to engage in collaboration. But the choice was dependent on the conflict at the very first place. Otherwise, why would you even try to collaborate? So you see that there's a very, I think, obvious dynamic in terms of conflict and collaboration that we often tend to disregard, at least in research, but I think also in practice, when you gather all these people together and now we're going to collaborate, but you have a lot of conflicts in the room and you try to rub them out or disregard them. Or it could also be in terms of like if you have these conflicts for some reason, you choose not to include the ones that would be mostly in conflict with others. And then you have less conflict in the collaborative initiative, but you have left out this other group of actors, which are very important if you want to come up with a, tangible solution to actually address the problem.
Yeah. It reminds me quite a lot, and I don't want to sidetrack us with this, but maybe worth mentioning, something that we've worked on in Japan quite a lot is this idea, and it's not a Japanese idea, but the idea of landscape approaches or the landscape approach, which is kind of you've probably heard of this, right? But it's sort of a way of dealing with multiple uses and multiple users of the landscape. And in our context, it's sort of from a biodiversity point of view. And basically what that means is getting everyone together or representatives together to basically, it's kind of like a conflict exploration exercise almost. Where are the conflicts between the different groups and how to resolve them? And the idea there is that, you could come to agreements quite quickly by excluding, as you suggested now, excluding those that are most likely to conflict. But then you're just kind of putting off the problem to a later date, probably by doing that. But I mean, I guess that what that means in a situation like that, essentially what you're doing is collaborating, right?
Yeah, But it's getting into, for example, like that framework or theory in political science, which is called the advocacy coalition framework. And to summarize that very simply would be that some actors have similar interests, and then they gather in a coalition. So they collaborate extensively within the coalition. But then the other actors, or the actors with a different interest, they gather in a different coalition. And they collaborate a lot within that coalition. But then between the coalitions, you have conflict.
Right.
So it's like, when you ask the question, like, okay, collaboration, is that solving the problem? From that perspective, the collaboration is equipping or kind of helping actors with similar interests to fight for their ideas against the opponent, which is another coalition also collaborating to fight back, and we know with other coalitions. So it's a good example where you have collaboration and conflict happening at the same time. And then if you come to that system and say, like, we need to collaborate, who should collaborate more? Is it within the coalitions or between the coalitions? And it's a massive difference there, like, because ideally then you probably want to have some collaboration across those coalitions. But if the only effect coming out from increasing the effort and collaboration is to have more intensive collaboration within the coalitions, you haven't really addressed the problem. Or if the problem is the conflict between the coalitions. So it kind of gets into the question, who should collaborate? What is the objective? What is the intended outcome of the collaboration itself?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask next, actually, is who is it typically who collaborates? And maybe you can sort of illustrate by example.
Yeah, I think that depends on how it's essentially set up in a way. So you can think about this coalition formation. That could be seen as a bottom-up process where actors with similar interests and beliefs, they gather into coalition and with the purpose to get as much as they can in a policy process, for example. But in other cases, which is often quite common in the environmental domain, is that it could be like a public agency or it could be an NGO that set up a collaborative initiative, and they try to bring in a whole range of actors and stakeholders with the purpose to find solutions to a pressing environmental problem. So in that case, I would say they try to invite as a wide audience as possible, or a wide group of participants as possible. Of course, as we talked about before, that comes with many challenges, but I think in those cases, the objective is for them to try to find a solution to a specific problem, though. And it could work out, but what I'm saying here is that could be quite difficult. Again, if they have deeply rooted conflicts of interest, and then ask them to come up with a solution, maybe that's just too ambitious. Another way gets into reframing the problem. Could be to have a lower ambition and gather these different actors with the objective to try to learn from each other and try to stay away from come up with a solution, because that could be the more conflictual thing. Like, it would be hard to come up with a solution, but maybe we can listen to each other and see if we can learn from each other. And learning could be that, as we said before we started, is like, I understand better why you have a different viewpoint in this matter. And if you understand the rationale behind your opponent's viewpoint, and you think it's fair, but you don't agree, but you think it's reasonable, then I think you have opened up the possibilities for actually have more fruitful collaboration or negotiation, and even reaching some kind of compromise, if you have started to understand the rationale behind your opponent's behavior or what they want to accomplish. So that could be like, you change the objective of the collaborative initiative from coming up with a solution to learn and try to agree on the problem, but not necessarily the solution. And I think it's hard to not make a similarity with the cooperation of the party, like all these nation states coming together to address the problem of climate change. I would say that the underlying objective here is to come up with a solution to climate change, and that's obviously we need to come up with a solution. But maybe that's too ambitious in a way. Maybe the conflicts that we see all the time between the countries is not necessarily that they disagree on there's a problem with climate change. They might disagree on the solution. And if you disagree on the solution, it doesn't take long before you start to disagree on the problem.
Right.
And if you disagree on the problem, you don't have anything to, and it's going to be even harder then to address the problem.
Yeah.
So it kind of gets into psychology that I think it's like solution aversion. If you present a problem directly associated with a specific set of solution and you don't like the solutions, you might not agree on the problem. And if you don't agree on the problem, why you should collaborate?
You've reminded me of two examples, one of them international and the other one very local. The international one is the way in US politics, in particular, with the polarizing influence of Donald Trump. And this goes back to 2016, at least, I think, is that there seems to be a tendency to, even when he's doing the right thing, there seems to be a tendency to disagree with it or go against it because that was his idea or he's associated with that idea. And that goes in the other direction as well. It's certainly being done by his own party to the Democrats. And then another example, which is maybe similar, tell me if I'm completely off track here, but it just reminds me of some work that I did many, many years ago. This is in the 1990s, where I interviewed a bunch of farmers in a very rural part of South Africa. And I needed to ask them questions about basically how they controlled problem animals. So things like jackal and caracal, these are sort of wild cats and wild jackals. And they don't like to be asked these kinds of questions because, I was sort of this English-speaking city slicker. They were all, I often had to speak Afrikaans to them. That they were not comfortable speaking English. And culturally, I was completely out of my element. But what I realized quite quickly was that the only two ways I could sort of make any progress was, number one, forget about getting quick answers to questions. Spend lots of time just sitting there and getting to know these guys and talking about what they'd like to talk about, and then sort of earning trust.
Yep.
And then the other thing that I sort of learned, maybe perhaps a bit less relevant, but you can tell me if it's relevant at all, was you could say feigning complete knowledge, which means that's probably a bit less relevant. But I think the more important thing was just this idea of spending time with them and earning trust and letting the conversation develop gradually, and literally, what initially was planned as 1 hour interviews often ended up being full day interviews, from 8 in the morning until after supper time and through meals, I'd sit with them over lunch and over supper.
Sure, it's a very good point. I was thinking about mentioning that because I think that's crucial. If you bring in this broad group of stakeholders that might have conflict of interest and different perceptions about problems and solutions and whatever, and you want them to come up with a solution, it's a pretty challenging endeavor, and it usually takes a lot of time. As you say, first you need to get to know each other a little bit, and then you need to understand what the others are saying. Because, they might use different terminology and they describe things in a different way. And you don't really understand what they talk about. And then it goes on, and maybe, hopefully, at some point, you sort of develop some trust. Okay, I actually believe that they are trying to be honest, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that takes a lot of time. I had this interview with a participant in a water governance initiative in Sweden, and he was saying the first 4 years, we spent time with Swedish fika, essentially having coffee and buns, and just talking to each other. And after 4 years, we started to understand what the others were saying. 4 years. Which means we might be too quick to say this was a failure. And we actually started to say it's a complete waste of time. It could be in some cases, but maybe we are too quick to assess the outcome. It takes years and years and years for this collaborative initiative where you have different actors with different interests to actually find common ground. It could be decades in the worst case for them to actually come up with a tangible solution to a problem that they all agree on. And they agree on the problem, they agree on the solutions, and they agree on actually doing that and so on. Such a long time. And then, of course, you have this dilemma because many environmental problems we don't have decades of time to develop that trust. And which kind of begs the question, can we speed up that collaborative process so you can develop trust among actors in less than 4 years, preferably in a week? So how is that going to happen? I don't think it's impossible to speed up the process, but I think, like, as your example is pointing to, like, some things are really hard to speed up. So if you then choose a more collaborative approach to address a problem, you probably need to invest much more time into that. And you probably also need to be a bit more patient in terms of the outcome. So you can even say that, even though I previously said that the cooperation of the parties seems like not super successful, maybe that was too early to assess. It's an ongoing process. It's been going on for decades, and it goes up and down and so on. But maybe it's too early to say it hasn't really succeeded, and it has done stuff clearly. So maybe that could be like the expectation problem. You expect this collaborative initiative to deliver good solutions that everyone would agree on, and maybe that's just unrealistic. At least in the short time frame.
Is that maybe also an argument for not collaborating? Because if you have a limited amount of time to solve a problem, and you know from experience that, solving it in a collaborative way is going to take a long process of relationship building, maybe that then means that, okay, look, we're going to forget about this, or we're going to do it by ourselves without collaborating.
Yeah. Again, in some cases, it's no other option than collaborate, but then maybe you can think about reframe the collaborative objective so you don't aim for the biggest problem, the first thing. So okay, it seems like you would waste time then on spending time on developing small wins, but maybe that's the only way to get to bigger wins, and it might actually save you some time in the process. Other cases, you might think about other solutions without necessarily bringing all the stakeholders into one collaborative initiative and then essentially try to do something.
Right.
Actually gets into another point I was also like to bring up, is that depends a little bit on the context though, but collaboration has its pros and cons. That's clear. And I think you can summarize what I'm saying here. This is a balancing act between different competing objectives, or trade-offs between what you can accomplish, how much time it takes, and how much conflict you can cope with, and so on. You have to find a good balance there. But it's also like there are so many collaborative initiatives happening all the time across the world, I would say. So actors with a specific objective interest in something that has to do with the environment, they usually have a whole range of collaborative initiatives they can choose to engage in, more or less. But their time is limited, and their willingness to invest in any specific collaborative initiative might be lowered if you have 25 other initiatives that you should also engage in. So this is kind of, there's even a paper about that. It's called Population Ecology of Network Domains by Nobel and Albrecht, which I think is just excellent. And what they essentially point to there is that there's a limited number of actors in a given domain, but there seems to be an unlimited number of collaborative initiatives in the same domain. And what happens then, people, these actors try to participate in all these different collaborative initiatives because there's a fear of missing out there. So you don't know what's going to happen. So you need to be there. But there are so many of them, and they just new ones popping out all the time. So you stretch your resources very thin. And then given that for a collaborative initiative to actually come up with some good solutions, you need to invest a lot of time, resources, trust, and so on. And if you're spread out across all these different initiatives, what is the likelihood that you actually will accomplish anything in these different initiatives? So that could actually be like an effect of thinking too simply about collaboration. Like, we need to collaborate more, and if it doesn't really work, we need to collaborate even more. If that translates into creating more and more collaborative initiative, it might actually make things worse.
Right. It's a similar principle to the small gains idea, right? It's sort of concentrating your efforts and consolidating your efforts into something you're more likely to be able to do. It also makes me think, this is purely theoretical, but just in life in general, I find that this idea of small gains is quite powerful, because small gains have a tendency to create or to multiply, to create more gains. Maybe one example, which is something I have been thinking about recently, which you can sort of comment on how relevant this is. But also many years ago, when I was working on some conservation planning initiatives in South Africa, South Africa has quite a rich history of conservation planning and mapping, and has done some incredible work. But one thing that I was sort of wondering about was, there was this prioritization of ecosystems. So which ecosystems are the most endangered, the most threatened? That was question number one, and almost the only question involved. And I was just kind of wondering, shouldn't we also be looking at where we can make the quickest gains, to get a foothold, and to make sure something's conserved, which can easily be conserved for a long time, rather than, scrambling to try to conserve this very endangered piece of land, which might be under just irresistible development 1 year later. So the idea is sort of looking at not just which is most critical and which is most high priority, but also which is most doable.
Yes, I think it's a good example. It's like focus on these small wins where we can actually make some progress.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, for example, like if you have a collaborative initiative and all the actors gather and they collaborate and they try to learn from each other and they come up with something, and then in the end it doesn't lead to anything, they might only be left with this being dissatisfied with collaboration. And then the next time someone invite them for collaborative initiative would say, sure, I'll be there, but they don't necessarily invest that much.
Yeah.
The positive side with the small wins or small gains would be that you come together, you deal with a much less complicated and less severe problem than many of these problems that are facing us today. But you actually manage to come up with some kind of solution, and you can actually see that solution gives some benefits back to you, even small. Okay, you have built confidence. You build confidence among the actors and participants, which means that the next time, or you can continue with the same collaborative initiative, and then you can maybe try to tackle more complicated, more severe, more conflict-ridden questions. And based on the confidence you had from the small wins, you can tackle these larger problems and maybe make some progress there as well. So I think that's the more incremental approach to collaborative, in terms of what kind of outcomes you can get, which could be more fruitful.
Yeah.
In particular, if there are high level of conflicts, there are inevitable trade-offs between different interests and so on.
Yeah.
It's really hard to tackle all that things in the same time when you basically often start up with some level of mistrust among the participants and so on.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that we've discussed before, this idea that incremental gains are sort of a low risk, low return strategy, right? Whereas transformative change is a high risk, high return strategy. So, if you're an investor, you know that both of those are important, right? You need to do both of those. But I think that we in the environmental field are, and this is the part that we've discussed before, I think we're strongly affected by this idea that the urgency is just so great that there's no time for low risk, low return incremental steps. We just got to go all in, and we've got to make it work.
I think that's a good point. So we need to make it work. It's not necessarily leading to it will work.
Right.
But I think, again, and you kind of indicated that maybe we need to have a little bit of a mixture there. So why only going for one type of solution, one type of process? So maybe only doing incremental change and small gains might be not the best way forward, because you essentially limit yourself to slow progress. But if you only go for transformative change and that is not really turning out to give any useful outcome, you have lost as well. So maybe this kind of mixture there. And I think also what we're saying here, that's something that could appear as a kind of small step, incremental approach over time could build up to something which is much bigger though.
Right.
So yeah, but it's hard to say which approach you can go for. And it could be cases where it might look more or less impossible to come up with something, and then suddenly it actually works out and you have some big change coming out of that. So that kind of gets into also in favor of having a mixture of approaches here, because it's a kind of a risk hedging approach if you have different type of initiatives happening at the same time.
Yeah. I've taken us a little bit away from the collaboration focus. I think this is a demonstration of our mutual interest in transformative change. But just to get back to the collaboration and collaborative processes argument in particular, another question I wanted to ask was about power imbalances. So collaborative processes are often seen as inclusive and democratic, but the critics, and I guess we could say you're one of them, argue that they can reinforce existing power balances, this idea of collaboration. So how does that happen? Under what conditions does collaboration actually reproduce inequality rather than mitigating inequality?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, I think, because it's hard to say exactly what it would be and so on, what factors and conditions and so on. But I think it at least partly gets back to what the actors themselves think they can get from the collaboration. So this might be a more cynical approach to it, but if you think that you have the power to win the game, why would you collaborate? You can still collaborate, but you wouldn't really sincerely try to collaborate. It would be just a means for you to win, essentially. And if that's your mindset when you engage in a collaborative initiative, you would essentially amplify the power asymmetries, or at least you wouldn't change them in any way, though. So it's partly the intent of the actors that could lead to that unfavorable outcome from collaborative initiative. The way to deal with that, that's a tricky one, though. But research tells us like facilitation, like trying to facilitate the collaborative endeavor is super important.
Mm-hmm.
So you could, in those cases with good facilitation, it is possible to mitigate these power imbalances because they usually are there. So you can make sure, for example, that the process of collaboration it's democratic in a broad sense, that everyone have an opinion to raise their voices, and you have procedural rules on how this collaboration should actually happen and so on, which could be a way to mitigate some of these power asymmetries, which mean that they don't just disappear, but you can mitigate them. But it kind of relates on good facilitation. Mm-hmm. But it also, if some actors have this idea that, I'm powerful, I can actually win this. How do you convince them that it would actually be good for you to collaborate? Because you cannot necessarily win. You would actually gain from collaboration, because in the long run, you're going to lose. So that could be more, what can you do to work the mindsets of those actors that might see this as just a way for them to utilize the power asymmetry. It sounds a bit negative, I think, but I think there could be cases like that. Even the most powerful actor, I think, doesn't necessarily feel entirely safe in their position. So they might realize, okay, so I'm in a good position now, but I'm not sure about the future. So maybe that could be good for me to kind of reach out to others with a conflict of interest and see what could be done. Have a more sincere approach to collaboration. That is something that really requires trust among both ends, I would say. It's not only about trust from the powerful to the less powerful. It should actually go both ways. And then you get into trust building, and that's something that typically takes a lot of time and good facilitation. Mm-hmm. So how to avoid power asymmetries to escalate through collaborative initiative? I think like the first very basic principle would be aware of it and don't disregard it. Think about how you can facilitate the process to try to mitigate these power imbalances. Also, maybe try to focus the objective of the collaboration that is not necessarily directly pointing to the key conflict of interest, because then there's a risk that the more powerful one would never give up on anything, but find something else where they can actually, find some useful compromise, maybe.
A common ground. Yeah. It again goes back to this whole idea of trust building and, having a discussion and finding those small gains, as a way to build the rest onto. But just wanted to clarify what you were saying about the collaborators who are in the strongest position. You said that even they would not feel completely safe. That's because of what can change over time, basically, right? So again, I'm thinking of the landscape approach idea. I think the philosophy behind the landscape approach is that you engage the different, despite the difficulty in doing so, you engage the different stakeholders, because if they're unhappy about the outcome of what's being done with this land that's shared, this landscape that's shared, if they're unhappy about it, eventually, problems are going to resurface again later, and they could resurface in a bigger way than they did before.
Yeah, I think because like the point, this is maybe the same thing though, but like if you as an actor, let's say you're a powerful actor, and you think everything is, set up in my favor, and I don't think there's a risk that that's going to change in the future, then of course, like, why would you collaborate? If the collaboration means that you need to engage with others with conflict of interest and so on, and find solutions that everyone will be satisfied with, because bluntly said, the only thing you can get from that collaboration would be to lose some of your advantage. And why would you do that?
Right.
Again, more cynical, but I don't think it's specifically we talked about the environment that many actors would be in that position, because even though you might do very good right now, it's like if you look in the future, you might not do very good in 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 5 years from now. So there's always this risk, like the shadow of the future, that could make these actors much more willing to actually engage more sincerely in a collaboration with others with conflict of interest, and maybe try to find solutions, because it would be a way for them to safeguard for an unknown future. So that it could be more about the perception, and maybe that's also where a place where science can make a contribution, and essentially emphasizing that the world is changing, and what seems to be good or bad now is not necessarily good or bad for you in the future, and so on. So, but we can address that and kind of create a little bit of a problem awareness of all actors.
Yeah.
I would just want to say that it doesn't only apply to people with power. This is also to people with less power. That, for example, like collaboration could be one way for the less powerful one to actually get some power. If you coordinate within a coalition, and you can be powerful by the number. And if you're powerful by the number, the powerful actor might feel like, okay, I used to be in a very good position here. I could essentially rule the game, but suddenly my opponent has gathered in different coalitions and became much more powerful. And then suddenly I actually realized I need to collaborate.
But also, just having a seat at the table can be quite a power enabler, right? I mean, actors who haven't had that opportunity before, that's maybe it doesn't guarantee them a very strong voice, but it's maybe more than they had before,
It's a first step, at least.
First step, yeah. Just had one remaining question. So the question is, environmental governance often assumes that better knowledge, and this touches very much on the previous episode that I just released today, that better knowledge and more learning will lead to better outcomes. But your work, as well as the work of Mark Neff, who I interviewed before, your work suggests that even when learning occurs, it doesn't necessarily translate into action. So I guess the question here would be, why do you think that is? I mean, you can answer a different question about it if you like, but that's kind of the angle I wanted to take.
Yeah, it's a good question, though. It's like, it's kind of built into that, why would you collaborate? And often, as you said in the very beginning, like, here's a problem, we need to collaborate around the solution. And then essentially you frame the collaboration around finding a solution. But maybe the first step in many of these more complicated environmental problems is to come up with some better understanding on what is actually the problem and what is causing the problem, and what could the consequences be if we continue with this and that and so on. And that is something that has to do with learning. And learning in a collaborative endeavor, that could actually be the main objective. Like, you gather these actors to learn from each other. And if that works out fine, they can walk away from that collaborative initiative with a better understanding of the problem, phenomena, and so on, which is good. But it doesn't mean that they have come up with a solution. So that's the differentiation between defining and understanding a problem versus agreeing on a solution. And it's a very different thing, because, for example, like, as we said in the beginning, like, my opponent, you might think that my opponents, where I have conflict of interest, they don't get it. They are lost, or they have kind of evil objectives or whatever. And you come together, you learn from each other, you start to understand how others are reasoning, and you also are getting a better understanding of the problem itself. And you might feel this is great, but we haven't really got into the solution, because come up with a solution might be the most tricky one. There are often many different types of solutions around the problem. And just agreeing on the problem doesn't mean that you agree on a solution. It's just maybe the starting point. Again, if your expectation of the collaboration would be to come up with a solution, and the only thing you come up with is some kind of joint understanding of the problem, it could be seen as a failure. But I would say it's a good first step. But it's obviously, if you want to address the problem, it's just the first step, and the problem is still learned. So yeah, again, kind of focusing again on what is the intended outcome of the collaboration itself. Is it to actually come up with a solution, or is it to pave the way maybe for a solution to come?